Greetings and warm welcome to Intersections, where our aspiration is to help us all explore the full possibilities in human potential, in you, in me, in us individually, as well as us collectively, and especially in us as humanity. And on this theme of our fullest potential, I can't think in some ways of a more central topic, a more critical topic of the hour based on everything that is unfolding within and around us than this theme of like how do we get really connected to that human fabric within our families and communities and our organizations and our teams and more broadly across the world. And on that topic, it is a great joy and privilege for me to have in our midst one of the preeminent researchers on empathy. I'm going to be introducing Jamil Zaki to you in just a minute. Before I do that, let's also get connected with each other. So take a moment here in chat, as so many of you are doing, to just say hello, to greet, and just welcome each other into this midst, right? And I'm so delighted to see the international nature of the community that we have been able to over time build here in Intersections. It's very heartwarming for me to see how we stand unified, essentially across the world for the kinds of aspirations and the kind of shared community we're able to create here. So thank you, and do invite your friends and family over time as well. For now, just enjoy your presence with each other. And as you do, let me share a couple of things about our dear friend and as you'll see, colleague in a meaningful project that I'm working on right now, Dr. Jamil Zaki. So Jamil is a professor at Stanford and a empathy researcher. He's the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. He teaches a very popular course on becoming kinder, which is designed to address this empathy crisis that you will see him talk about that we're facing in the world today to fight back against the increasing trend of polarization and disconnection. For the last about 15 years, he's been probing how empathy works, how it helps people, situations that can make empathy easier, and also situations that make it harder. Through his research, he's led a kindness revolution in schools and workplaces and hospitals and beyond. He's put a book out with his ideas, thoughts, and research, The War for Kindness. It's an inspiring call to action, exploring why it is that it feels harder than ever in today's world to connect, and how can we overcome these modern barriers to empathy, and what we should and must in fact try and do. He's been featured in leading media with his ideas. He's a very active and prolific writer with op-eds and articles on this theme. He's deeply invested in this cause, as you will see in your conversation with him as well. And here's just a beautiful quote from him to end this introduction, which is, "We are a link in an enormous chain of humanity. We each have a choice, and the sum of our choices will create the future." What a beautiful quote. By the way, as a mathematician, I'm always finding the mathematics and everything. And what I see here is the notion of integration. You integrate across a lot of small things, and you get the complete volume of karma, in a sense, that humanity has created. That's what I see in what you just shared there, Jamil. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Hitendra. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks. I look forward to this conversation.
Jamil, tell me. We're talking about this topic, I know, very close to your heart, and one that has drawn all of us to this moment as well. Let's just start, since you are a scientist, by having us define it. And so, loosely speaking, the word empathy is being used out there a lot today, both in society and in business. How would you, as a psychologist, define it?
Yeah, thanks for starting there. And hi, everyone, by the way. It's great to see where you all are tuning in from. It's really important to start by defining our terms, because over the course of my career, I've heard Hitendra, probably thousands of people give me hundreds of different definitions of empathy, each person as confident as the next, and all of them disagreeing with each other. So as researchers think of it, empathy is an umbrella term that describes at least 3 ways that we connect with each other's emotions. So for instance, let's say that as I logged onto this call, instead of being excited and enthusiastic as I am, I was weeping in anguish. Well, if you saw that, a bunch of things might happen in you. First, you might vicariously take on my feelings, becoming sad or upset yourself. That's what we would call emotional empathy or emotion contagion. Second, you might say, what is happening with Jamil? What is he feeling and why? That type of detective work is what we call cognitive empathy. And then third, Hitendra, because you are a good friend, you'd probably care about what I was going through and wish for me to feel better, which we would call empathic concern or compassion. Now, these three pieces of empathy might just sound like different ways of describing the same thing, but they actually split apart in really interesting ways. For instance, they're only a little bit correlated across the population. So if I know that you're someone who really takes on other people's feelings, that doesn't tell me that much about how good you'll be at understanding what someone else is going through. These different pieces of empathy are also supported by different systems in the brain. So a lot of my own work early in my career was focused on really dissecting empathy, trying to figure out its different parts, the same way that a mechanic might try to figure out the different parts of a car and how they work together to make the whole engine run.
Very powerful. So the difference between just like thinking and understanding versus then actually feeling, and I want to come back and unpack that a little bit more. But if I have your permission, I also want to work with you a little bit to maybe like push the boundaries, for your discipline, because
Sure.
I, as I've been giving it thought in the context of my studies of like leadership, for instance. In addition to the very, very core components you mentioned, there are a couple of others that I'm noodling over, and I want to see what you think of those. So the first is something I picked up from a very powerful like learning I got from Steve Jobs, which is how when he pioneered his life story at Apple, the thing that he seemed to always believe was that people were designers at heart, that people had a much greater aesthetic hunger and sense and capacity to judge and actually pay for it than we did justice to them about, right? And so he took the cell phone industry, saw how, essentially feature rich but design poor cell phones were, in the past. And then he really pushed his team and himself, right, to that place where we now have like magic in our hands, so to say. Now, of course, you're going to come and talk about some of the downside of that very soon. We want to hear that as well. But this notion of just like elegant design, which is a movement that has swept the world. I remember there's a comment from one of the designers who said, like, what Steve Jobs said is like, people don't understand. These cell phone companies don't understand. People really crave good design. And I tell you, like, it really, for me, made me realize, like, my heavens, I've never judged people to be like necessarily good arbiters of what is good design versus not in general. There are those that are the aesthetes, those people who really love great art and all of that, but the average population, right? But he saw something in them that even they were not necessarily seeing and acknowledging in themselves. And like the question I have for us is potentially empathy also about that, which is not just that in this moment, the person is feeling, let's say, tired or angry or concerned, but also I see some hidden potential in them, maybe like a divine spark in them that maybe even they're not seeing in the moment. But if I can help them awaken to that, then perhaps they'll be discovering even more of what they're truly about. What do you think of that?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I would say that what you're describing is a steering process where we don't just meet people where they are, but we try to guide them to where we might imagine they would like to be. Another way of thinking about that is that in those cases, you're connecting not just with the person's current experience, but with their potential future. And you're maybe trying to co-create that future with them. I mean, I think that one really beautiful thing in what you just said is, I guess one maybe slightly more poetic way of describing empathy is that it has two sides to it. The first is a deep and I would say a visceral in our body acknowledgement that someone else's reality is just as true as our own, even if it's very different from ours, right? So they might see things in a different way than we do, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong or that we're right. I mean, that those two realities are both valid. The second, though, is an invitation or an action that we take to try to merge parts of our reality together. And in the case of Steve Jobs, in the case of design, in the case of beauty, really, a lot of art, and we can get into talking about the relationship between art and empathy, but I think a lot of art and science as well is basically a process of discovering something and then trying to get that into the heads of other people. I mean, if you think about even what we're doing right now, conversation is, I mean, this is like what I used to think about in college all the time. it's just this miraculous biological feat where I am, perturbing the air between us, and somehow trying to get your brain into a state that is similar to the state that's in my brain right now. It's honestly miraculous if you think about what we're able to do. Is that the connection that you're trying to draw here, Hitendra?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's so beautifully put. You put it in such a more articulate and poetic way than I did. There is something that you've said in your book that I want to quote. Just this one sentence, which I think feeds on the last point that you just made. And you say, like, when one creature shares another's emotions, then seeing pain feels like being in pain, and helping feels like being helped. I
Yeah,
found that very powerful.
that's right. And that really comes from in the Western philosophical tradition. Really, the study of empathy, it doesn't begin, but it really gains a lot of steam with a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. Adam Smith, of course, more famous for The Wealth of Nations and be kind of the father of modern capitalism, but he wrote about what he called sympathy, which we would now think of as emotional empathy, that sort of vicarious taking on of what other people feel. And he called it the moral sentiment because he basically said, this is the foundation of our sense of right and wrong. And to build on your point, Hitendra, if when I see you in pain, it feels like being in pain, well, I have every motive to not cause you pain. And if when I see you happy, I feel happy, I have every motive to do whatever it takes to help make you happy or fulfilled or to help you find meaning. In other words, one way of thinking about this is, we often talk about the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. Empathy really makes clear how blurry the division is between you and me, and therefore how instinctual the golden rule can be. We often think of the golden rule as like the vegetables that you need to eat cycle, right? We'd rather be selfish, but we need to be kind to others just because that's some principle that we have. Well, empathy is not necessarily a principle, it's an experience that turns that into a very natural impulse, right? Because it acknowledges that in fact, you and I are merged in some way. And so treating you well is treating me well, and treating you poorly is treating myself poorly.
Incredible, really, really beautiful. I find such a beautiful connection emerging there with spiritual traditions around the world as well. That I've often talked about, in a sense, your own higher self being your connection with every atom in the universe, and every piece of life that throbs in any part of the universe. So there's something really beautiful in the way that you are framing empathy for us. So thank you. Well, let's talk about what is going on in the world. You weighed in on this in some very heartfelt ways, in your book. It's very clear, Jamil, that you're not merely a scholar in this discipline, a researcher in this discipline. You are living this discipline. It's deep in your DNA. And we want to come back and reflect on your own personal journey a little later in this conversation. But for now, what is it, if you had to give us the state of the union as to, are we becoming more empathetic? Are we becoming less empathetic? Is it a real issue or not today? Share with us your point of view.
Yeah, so first of all, you're exactly right. I think one interesting part of my life over the last many years has been living as a scientist who studies something, and then also just as a human being who's connected to it. And I don't think that I'm uniquely connected to empathy. I think we all are connected to it because we're all connected to each other. But I think to answer your question, there are a lot of data about the shift in empathy over time, and those data do not point to a very optimistic picture, I'm afraid to tell you. So the most common way that psychologists in my corner of science measure empathy is a simple questionnaire, a series of statements, and you're asked how well each one describes you from 1 to 5. So for instance, I might ask you how well this statement describes you. I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than myself. Or I try to look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision. So your response to those plus 26 other prompts would give you an empathy index from 1 to 5. So that test was developed in the 1970s. And since then, I'd say millions of people have taken it. And researchers recently decided to look at the trends over time. And they found a steep decline in empathy over a 30-year span from 1979 to 2009. So to put this in perspective, the average American in 2009, according to their own self-report, was less empathic than 3/4 of Americans just 30 years before. And if you think about the way that we've been talking about what empathy does for us, the way it connects us, the way that it makes us healthier and more fulfilled and I suppose stronger people, then losing this is kind of like losing a vital resource, like sort of like losing a vital natural resource, except instead of an environmental one, it's a psychological one.
I've been thinking about what you shared on this in the book, and now you're sharing here with us as well. And I have a state of confusion a little bit about, are we becoming sort of more heart-based, more empathetic, or less, right? And I think the survey, as you've shared, would suggest the trends longitudinally that well, we seem to be at least self-rating ourselves to be less so.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there might also, though, be a rising standard that we are all aspiring for that has also awoken us to the gap between that standard and where we are today, more than perhaps in some communities people were awoken to, in the past. I just wonder. I mean, I don't know. It's just a thought for you to maybe react to.
I'd like to think that. And, one thing that I often really respond negatively towards is when I describe those data and people kind of respond with some version of kids these days, as though younger generations are all full of themselves and not focused on other people. Well, I interact with young adults. I teach college students on a very regular basis. I interact with hundreds of them, and they, to me, are deeply compassionate. And as you say, responding to a real awakening to the need for human rights, for instance, in a broad way, the need for global responsibility in a broad way, the need to acknowledge privilege and understand how we can do for those who have less in a really powerful way. So I like to believe that what you are describing is right. That said, I'm afraid to tell you that the decline in empathy is not alone. So as empathy has declined, we've seen other psychological trends as well. Our trust in one another has plummeted, at least in the US over the last 50 years. Our cynicism, our belief that others are generally selfish, has skyrocketed. Even interestingly, in the use of language, we've changed. So the use of the first person singular, I, me, mine, has increased in frequency in the English language over this time. And finally, our mental health appears to be deteriorating. People report being much lonelier, much more anxious, and much more depressed than they did, again, decades ago. And this is even pre-pandemic. I mean, it's obviously many of these trends have gotten worse during the pandemic, but I'm describing pre-pandemic. I'm sorry to be such a downer, Hitendra, but I'm afraid that the decline in empathy is part of a cluster of really troubling signs if you're a psychologist.
You say in your book, if you wanted to design a system to break empathy, you could scarcely do better than the society we've created. So what is it in the world that we've created that may be pulling down empathy, as you've just described?
Well, yeah, let's start with the world that created empathy, right? I mean, so whenever you look at a feature of our psychological lives, you can start by going all the way back 100, 200,000 years and think about what was the environment in which that characteristic developed. And so if you think about empathy, well, when human empathy in its modern form developed, we were living in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers, just a few families apiece. And so what that meant is that if you ran into somebody else, they were probably really familiar to you, maybe even related to you. You were interdependent. You counted on one another. You were visible to each other. We could see pain and pleasure on each other's face and hear it in each other's voice. And people were accountable to one another. I knew your history of kindness and cruelty and you could pay it back. I mean, karma was real and palpable at that time. I think of those parts of social life as empathy's primordial soup, right? The sort of the environment in which it grew. And even now, empathy comes most naturally and most powerfully to us when life is that way. When I'm in the room with you, when I know you well, when we have a history of interaction, and when we have a future of interactions. More and more, though, those ingredients have receded. from our day-to-day lives, right? We're more likely to live alone than ever in history. Our interactions with each other are more irregular and more transactional. And finally, we're technologically mediated in a way that we never have been. I mean, this conversation is terrific because it's got a lot of those prompts that allow us to connect with one another. I can see you, I can hear you. We've got a long space to chat and to open up. But many interactions that we have, I think you would agree, are much more thinned out and really not created for us to fully connect with each other as human beings. Oh, I think you're muted, Hitendra.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's talk about these interactions then, because I mean, I was muted, and that maybe is symbolic in some ways of like what's going on in the world right now, isn't it? You talk about how we are muting each other out, right? Like to just be really comfortable in the din of our own voice, right? And those in our echo chamber. You say it so beautifully. You talk about one of humans' most natural tendencies at times is to like divide people into us and them, and it's also one of the fastest way to snuff out empathy. It's something that I really also relate to a lot. Is how do we get our world beyond that place where there's a quick rush to judgment and a dividing into an us versus them, and then a shutting out of any new ideas and possibilities. Adam Grant, of course, has been reflecting on this as well, more from cognitive standpoint, right? But from an empathy standpoint, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your research and interest in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the biggest topics in the world of empathy science is, why is empathy so fragile? Why does it disappear in moments of conflict or when we define or divide the world into us and them, as we really often do? It's almost as though there are these two ancient psychological forces. One, a very natural, really easy division of the world into categories, which is really useful in some cases, but really harmful in others. And the other is this natural ability we have to connect with one another. And they are sort of like a seesaw with each other, right? If I really decide that you are a them, that you're totally distinct from me, and especially if we're in conflict, well, that will, as you say, snuff out my empathy. And by contrast, when people make really important sort of personal one-on-one connections with somebody who's on the other side of a social boundary, suddenly we become aware that those social boundaries are artificial and that really the only thing in between us is air, right? And that we're just two human beings instead of two members of different armies at war with each other. And so, one of the things that's most powerful for overcoming those divisions is simply longer conversations, less judgmental conversations, simply being willing to pause and to hear each other's stories instead of just sniping at each other about our opinions. There's a lot of work that's coming out on this now in both psychology and political science. The big question is, how can we produce more conversations like that? Because right now our world isn't really built for them.
I love the storytelling that you have in your book, Jamil, on topics like this, because you're not just researching them from a very data-driven and experimentation standpoint. You're also giving us living examples of people who are walking these paths, either these paths of struggle and conflict and separatedness, or then transformation and growth and acts of, I would call them like heroic empathy. Empathy. By the way, I also want to pause for a minute and thank two people in our mutual lives who have made our paths cross together. So our dear friend Feroz, who's actually on this show with us, some time back, one of the early voices on Intersections, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to just share a link to that Intersections because, as you know, he's such a force of nature. And one who is so invested in this whole, living life with like the optimize empathy, right, for the whole world, and then also Josh Davis, who's been a fellow classmate of yours in graduate school, and is our chief scientist here at Mentora. So I'm so grateful that our paths have crossed, Jamil, because it's been and just an ever increasing sense of joy I get from spending time with you, as I am in this present moment.
The feeling is totally mutual. And as you say, Feroz and Josh, just two wonderful people and wonderful connectors themselves.
Yes, yes, so true. We've actually had Josh on the show as well, talking about managing time, right, in a smart and thoughtful way. So maybe my colleagues can put up his intersections as well. So let's continue on this path that we were on. One of our other voices on intersections, Fred Dust, who's a beautiful kind of also beautifully invested in this whole science of like what it takes to make effective conversations happen. He made this very thoughtful quote last time he was here with us. He said, "A creative conversation is about choosing to hold your existing beliefs more lightly."
I love that, and I think that's absolutely part of a conversation that works, and part of one that can replace division with empathy. I think withholding judgment is critical. I think that being less wedded to your own perspective. Again, it gets back to this idea of acknowledging that somebody else's reality is real to them, right? That just because theirs is different than yours, that doesn't make them disingenuous or unintelligent or evil or anything like that, right? I often think about, do you remember that dress that was black and blue, but some people for some wild reason thought it was white and gold? Do you remember this dress, Hitendra?
No, I don't.
Oh, it was called The Dress, and it was this famous image of a dress that was this designer fashion dress, and it created a war on the internet because some people experienced it as being black and blue.
I see.
And others believed fervently that it was white and gold, right? And this is not a political division. It's just literally a division in what we are seeing. And I think that example always stuck out to me because people just couldn't imagine somebody seeing things the other way, and vice versa, right? And I think that's really critical to remember when you're entering a conversation where there's any disagreement, is that this person, unless you have any reason to believe that they're lying to you, is probably not. They're probably representing their own version of the world as honestly as they can. And I think that's a very brave thing to do during disagreement. So I would say that certainly, holding on to our opinions less strongly is part of it. And then I think really acknowledging and believing and having faith in the other person on the other side of that conversation as being a full human is important. I know that sounds really obvious, but I think we often, instead of focusing on the other person, just live in our own reactions to what they're saying. And I think that's a very natural, but a very toxic way to have conversations. So one thing that I often suggest to people is, if you're having a disagreement, ask yourself, what am I learning? What is one thing that I now think of differently after this conversation than I did before? What is one thing that I didn't know that I learned? And if the answer to that is nothing, then maybe you haven't been listening as well as you think you have.
That's powerful. That's powerful. It makes really good sense. You talk about some incredible transformations in your book. There's a story about Tony, who left a far right neo-Nazi kind of past behind to ultimately become a whole different kind of person. And then you mentioned how he was once confessing, his past to a Jewish man, and his new Jewish friend responds with, that's what you did, but not who you are, and I see you. I thought that was so powerful, that whole story of Tony.
Oh yeah, and I mean it's to me one of the most moving examples of what in psychology we call contact theory. So contact theory is this idea that in essence prejudice and hatred are harder to do, are easier to do from a distance. If I don't really know you, I can just slap a label on you, whether it's a category that's related to your ideology or your ethnicity or whatever, and decide that you are fundamentally different from me. But once you get close up, you realize that people are just too complicated and idiosyncratic to be described through any one part of their identity. And you awaken to the richness and humanity on the other side, again, of those boundaries. I think the really beautiful thing about Tony's story is that he was confessing, as you say, his past as a real virulent anti-Semite to a Jewish person. And that man, Dov Baron, did not need to, had no responsibility to respond with empathy. We never owe empathy to people who would treat us with hatred. But Dav decided to take that step. He decided, instead of reacting to what Tony was saying, with his own fear or anger, which would have been totally natural and valid, he decided to respond with compassion. And I think that that's such a powerful decision that we make too seldom, right? We often don't, turn the other cheek. We often meet anger with anger, or hatred with hatred. And we don't realize that if we instead, again, it's not our job, but if we instead decide to take that first step to respond with the opposite, to respond to hatred with compassion, how powerful that can be, how revolutionary that could be for people who are caught in that cycle of hatred.
That's so beautiful, so uplifting. A dear friend of mine, Taylor, she has shared this quote, having been inspired by your work, Jamil. We were having a discussion on empathy, and she mentioned this Rumi quote. Rumi, being this 13th century Persian poet, right, and Sufi mystic. And so he says, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about."
Wow. That's gorgeous. Wow. I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. I thought you might enjoy it because I see so much poetry in you, Jamil. There's some good tidings here that I'm seeing in chat from my friend Jake about how it is actually Josh's birthday today.
Oh, happy birthday, Josh.
Yeah. Sending love your way. Cool. And then there's I think a beautiful submission from David. He's talking about how Krishnamurti and Bohm, their work on dialogue, a few decades old, but they had some profound ideas and thoughts there about suspending judgment and assumptions and beliefs, right, as a way to really truly have an open space for dialogue. So let's do this. Let's move the conversation to another theme, which is we have this gap today in the world. We have this yearning and angst of wanting to kind of like do something about it. Can we actually do something about it? You've, in your book, given some really compelling evidence about how empathy is actually like a muscle that can be intentionally strengthened and developed. I think there's just a broad today groundswell of this kind of I think really empowering ideas coming out in science, that we are not confined and limited to who we have been in the past, which is wonderful. I would propose that we maybe go through this part of the conversation relatively rapidly with maybe like your favorite insight on this topic, and then move it on more to where I get the real goosebumps when I read about your work, Jamil, which is the contribution you're making to actually act upon this realization and put out there practices that people can take on both individually and collectively to really advance their empathy muscle. So I want to propose we move into that fairly rapidly, but just for a moment to make that transition. If you had to give your biggest, most pleasant sort of insight and understanding or surprise about how much can empathy be actually intentionally cultivated.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm going to try to be brief here because two things come to mind for me. The first is work that came out of Leipzig, Germany, in about 2017. That was a collaboration between people in contemplative traditions, Buddhist traditions, and neuroscientists there. And so this was a huge project where they had a large number of people practice different forms of meditation, including loving kindness meditation, or metta, which is sort of a compassion building practice every day. And then they examined their empathy, in a battery of different tests, psychological tests, and then also scanned their brains before and after this practice. And they found that that after engaging in these meditation practices every day for a few months, not only were people more effective at understanding what other people felt, at sharing other people's feelings, and they were more motivated to act kindly towards others, their brains also shifted. Parts of their brain that were associated with empathy, with empathizing with others, actually grew in volume. So, I often talk about empathy as a muscle that we can build and exercise. That's the best description of how real that is. It's metaphorical in certain ways, but truly, when we change our minds, we do change our bodies and our brains as well. And, the other thing that I'll say about that study is that when I first learned about loving kindness, I need to be sort of open and vulnerable with you, Hitendra, coming from a really, hard-boiled Western, research tradition, I thought it sounded kind of squishy, to be honest, and I was not convinced. And that collaboration really opened my eyes and made me very humbled that, in fact, the best ways to change ourselves, to develop ourselves, and including to build our empathy, might not come from research labs. They might already be here in ancient cognitive technologies that have been developed in spiritual traditions. And that, the fact that I'm engaged with hypothesis testing and statistical validation doesn't mean that that's the only way of learning and knowing.
Yeah. It's a beautiful it's a beautiful just reflection for you to do at a meta level, to step back and just kind of reflect on ways of knowing. And I have been deeply sort of inspired by science and by spirituality. And it's like these two different friends I've had in life, and I'm like, why don't you talk more with each other? Why don't you get to know each other? You're actually really, really beautiful people, right? And I think that's what's happening today. Science is starting to open itself up more to like some of these ancient pursuits that truth seekers have, for the most part, been engaged in more spiritual traditions, right? And on the other hand, also, I think like spirituality is moving beyond at times the confines of religion and institutional forms into a more kind of just more universal quest for like, what is this connection that I have with the universe? And people are asking those questions and pursuing their own paths in some beautiful ways, which I think hopefully can unify the world over time and bring science and spirituality also together. So that's, that's been so rewarding to see. So let's talk then about how we build this muscle. How we build this muscle. And again, I just want to start by saying kudos, because it is, and I think this is where, in addition to spirituality, I think science can just, like, in addition to validating what perhaps spirituality is already, let's say, discovered for itself, like loving kindness meditations. I think there is just so much more richness that I'm finding from some of the kind of work that you and your peers are doing in informing and guiding us to create some very simple, deceptively simple interventions that can have some real tangible impact in moving us one step closer, right, to an empathetic future. So can you talk about like one or two of the practices that, from you and other colleagues that you have found most like eye-opening as to the untapped potential there is in any or all of us, if we so choose, to really work on building our, personal empathy muscle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the first step, which is not always the first step that people think to take, is just realizing that we can do this. This is what, we would consider a growth mindset, an understanding that we are malleable. And oftentimes people don't realize, they think, okay, there are parts of me that I can develop, but empathy is not one of them. We tend to have this trait-like view where we imagine that some people are just born empathic and some people are not. And that belief is not just wrong, right? I mean, the science indicates that we can become more empathic, but it can also be toxic because it can discourage us from doing any work to change. I've heard a lot of people tell me, wow, Jamil, you've convinced me that empathy is this valuable quality to have. Too bad I'm just not good at it, so I won't try. And I say, well, hey, don't let yourself off the hook that easily. I think when we realize that we can change, and in fact, that the only thing we can't do is not change, right? That we're always changing, we realize it's our responsibility and our opportunity to kind of steer the ship, right? It's moving one way or another, but we can decide in which direction. And with that in mind, I think one of the most powerful little practices to do in building our empathy is, again, not to necessarily focus on big, I think when people imagine becoming more empathic, they think that they need to turn into Mother Teresa, by Thursday or something like that, or take some big giant action that redefines them. But, I compare being empathic and growing our empathy to trying to become more physically fit. Right? It's not about the big, grandiose actions. It's about the little habits that we cultivate. So a couple of things that I encourage students in my Becoming Kinder class to do is to try to form tiny habits of otherishness, right? So not selfishness, but otherishness. And that can be really centering somebody else's perspective, really, sort of trying to be curious about their humanity, or trying to engage in small acts of kindness, but doing this in a very low intensity way, very frequently, potentially every day, taking just a few moments of their day to intentionally reset around another person's experience instead of their own. And those little habits can be enormously powerful in creating long-lasting, steady change.
Hmm. I love that idea. What did you call it? Otherness?
Otherishness, yeah.
Otherishness. Yeah. So simple and yet so profound in the possibilities that it has. Yeah, there is one other key insight I got from your book, which is the importance of recognizing that it's not just something that is sparked from within. There are also conditions that are created from without, from around you, that can either support or limit our inclination towards empathy. And one of them was just the kind of standards and expectations and practices we see around us as to like what's normal in some ways. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the most profound insights from social psychology is that our reality is co-constructed. That what I experience, my version of the world, and yours, might be independent in certain ways, but they absolutely affect each other pervasively and profoundly. So, if you imagine that, if you realize and truly acknowledge that, hey, my capacity for empathy, my tendency to empathize, isn't just my own, solo sport. It's affected by, as you said, the social norms, my beliefs about what is typical or valued in the space that I'm in. And that can change, right? I mean, I might be at home thinking that empathy is hugely valued, and so I express it. And then at work, enter a really competitive organization where people are pitted against each other and decide, well, it's not safe to empathize here. So the first step is to acknowledge the effect, the profound effect that we have on each other, and that social norms, our beliefs about what's normal and typical, have on us. And then I think there are two sides of this. The first is to be mindful of what we're taking in terms of our social environment, right? Because I think of the people that we spend time with, the information that we consume, is very similar to the food that we eat or the air that we breathe. It changes us. And so when you make choices about which news station to tune into, which social media platform to engage with, or who to follow on social media, or simply who you want to be friends with, who you want to work with, you're shifting your social environment, which will in turn shift you. Another side of that same reality, that same insight, is that you are somebody else's social environment. That everything you do, every act that you take, will change what they think is normal, typical, and valued, and that will shape their tendency, for instance, to act empathically or not as well. And I think that's especially important for anybody who's in a position of leadership, because the norms that they set will shape the people who they lead.
Wow. And what flashes through my mind, and we should come back and talk more about the application of this in leadership, is also the central value this has in parenting, right? That some of those effects are very intangible and they're probably only witnessed 20, 30, 40 years later. But I tell you, I've been, in my study of leaders, been more and more struck by two things. One is early life experiences as a factor, and the other is how those people chose to react and respond and give meaning and storytell around those early life experiences.
Yeah.
And one of the, I mean, sorry, but before giving you the floor again, one of the really profound, just exemplary, I think, pieces of work there that I've seen is just your own introduction to your book. So we're going to come back to that in just a moment. We're going to come back to that. But yeah, you were saying something.
Oh, no, I just wanted to co-sign what you're saying. I mean, I think that some of the most profound work on the development of empathy, and really that shows how malleable it is, comes from parenting, and in particular from a group of people who tragically lacked parents. These are orphans in Romania. There's an entire generation of children who, for political reasons were basically institutionally raised, which meant that they had access to enough food and they had shelter, but they just didn't have human connection early in their lives. And those children, tragically developed very little empathy. I mean, their levels of empathy were sort of on par with that of someone who has psychopathy. But there was a happy ending for some of them, which is that they were adopted, some of them, by sort of your standard nuclear families. It turns out that those children went from having psychopath level empathy to having typical levels of empathy. And that tracked how warm and sort of, I guess, emotionally generous their parents were. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that parenting is the first and maybe the most profound norm setting we ever do. And I mean, I think it's no surprise to probably many listeners here that that's also one of the defining things in who we become. And that absolutely carries when it comes to empathy, and also continues to carry with our adult relationships as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. I'm very. I find it very profound to hear that there is actually this research to support, this thing, which is more for me anecdotal in terms of some of these leadership studies that I've done of their biographies. But it also makes me wonder. I know we have an international audience here, but just for a moment, zooming in on America, when painfully so, we have one of these mass shootings, and we all get very polarized about. Policies on guns, right, between the Republicans and the Democrats. I actually find that they are much more unified than it seems in the in the press, because they're very unified in the idea that it's all just about a debate on guns, because that is the tool through which those people's lives were taken away, was through a gun. But almost never has there been a very active conversation in the media about, hey, let's pause for a minute. Is there an impulse that comes before the gun? And where does that impulse arise from? And what are we doing in society to create generations of people that have so much compassion and empathy in them that that impulse will not even arise? Whether it's a knife or a gun or a stone, that's secondary to the, anyway. So that I think that's what you're speaking to here when you just talked about those kids in Romania.
Yeah, I mean, there's this famous phrase in clinical psychology that hurt people, right? That often our creation of suffering in others is an expression of the suffering that we have experienced ourselves. Now, let me be very clear that that's not the same as removing responsibility for harmful actions, right? I mean, you can absolutely still hold someone accountable for their actions, while understanding that they are acting from a human place. Right. Because humanity includes many dark places, right? Many dark experiences. And I think that when we dehumanize criminals and focus only on one side of the issue and don't think about what are we doing to people, or what is happening to people that is driving them so far off of what we would think of as a healthy life path, I don't think that we do anyone any favors. And I think it's one of the hardest things to do with our empathy is to extend it to people who don't seem to have it themselves. But that's one of the most powerful and important things that I think we should try to do as a society.
Yeah, very powerful, very beautiful. There is a question, from our audience about how do you differentiate empathy and compassion?
Yeah, so I was doing this a little bit during our definitional work at the beginning, but compassion is a motivational state, right? So if you think about empathy as having three different pieces, one is emotional, my co-experience of a feeling with you. The other is cognitive, my ability to understand what's happening with you. And the third is motivational, my desire for your well-being to improve. Compassion is that third motivational piece. So and most researchers think of that as a component of the broader umbrella of empathy. There are people in the field who would say that, nope, compassion is totally different from empathy. That's a definitional battle that probably is not of great interest, but I think the important thing is that compassion is the motivational part of empathy, and it's the part that is most related, by the way, to kindness, to the actions that we do take to benefit other people.
All right, so perfect. So compassion is empathy in action.
Yes, yes, that's a
Yes, yes.
beautiful way of putting it.
Perfect, perfect. So let's do that. Let's talk about empathy in action, not merely just for our own selves, but in our roles, as you mentioned, as leaders, as parents and beyond, as the makers and shapers of society. So I love that focus in your book also to building systems of kindness, right, in the world, and especially as we think about the professional world, the business world, organizations at large. How do we scale empathy, and then the school system as well? You have this beautiful story in your book about Jason, who for a while was being considered by his teacher to be a troubled kid who needed to be disciplined. Can you just in brief maybe like share that story?
Yeah, Jason Okonofwa is a really inspirational person. So he grew up in Memphis, quite poor and black, and he had two older brothers who got in a lot of trouble. He himself was, straight A student for quite a while, and was just a really responsible kid, but he was judged by his educators based on his brother's actions and based on the color of his skin, based on the clothes that he was wearing. And so he was repeatedly given suspensions and detentions for very little cause, and then eventually arrested for really not doing much of anything. And he was really at a crossroads where if he had been judged, as many young black people are, he would have been on a very tough life path. But instead, a judge saw his report card and saw that he was getting all A's, and he ended up on a different path. And that path is that he's now a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley. He got his PhD with us at Stanford, and his work is basically on what he experienced, the way that educators sometimes tend to judge black versus white students. And because those educators are in power and setting norms, setting the structures, they basically don't give those kids a chance to express their full potential. Jason developed one of my favorite projects that I've seen in a very long time, which was an intervention to reduce suspensions among poor and black children. But the intervention didn't focus on the kids. It focused on teachers, and in particular, focused on when teachers encountered a student who was struggling, maybe who had misbehaved in class or was doing poorly in the class. Instead of judging that student, Jason taught them to deliver discipline in a more empathic way, to ask more questions about how the student was doing, to frame their discipline, even if it was sending a kid to detention, as a way of trying to help them through a difficult moment. It turned out that compassionate sort of punishment, it's still punishment, that compassionate discipline reduced suspension rates among especially black, brown, and poor children enormously, right? So I think, again, it gets to this idea, Hitendra, that empathy isn't just about an individual process. It's about the structures that we build. And if you seed empathy in the people who are in power, they can create more just and equitable structures that allow the people in that system to thrive.
I love this couple of quotes from that story. Thank you for sharing that. Where in his work around creating empathic forms of discipline, right? He was asking some of these teachers like what approach have they taken to put more empathy into their moments of discipline, right? And I just want to read a couple of these quotes that you shared in the book. One of the teachers responded by talking about how, look, what I do is I greet every student at the door with a smile every day, no matter what has occurred the day before. What a great way of implicitly telling the student, you're validated, I love you, what happened yesterday. And then another one says, I never hold grudges. I try to remember that students are all the sons or daughters of someone who loves them. They are the light of someone's life. That was very moving.
It's so beautiful. And just really quickly, I think that, part of what Jason does that's so incredible to me, and he's also, by the way, done this with parole officers and reduced recidivism or sort of imprisonment of the people who they are supervising. Part of it, though, Hitendra, is that I think a lot of us value empathy if we just slow down enough to think about it. We value other people. We love other people. That's what we're built to do. And I think sometimes just in the hustle and the hassle of our day-to-day lives, you think about these teachers, many of them are probably so stressed, dealing with so much. And Jason, just in asking them to pause and reflect on what was most meaningful to them and their connection to their students changed them. It's not oftentimes that you have to force people to be empathic. You just have to remind them of who they truly want to be and who they truly are.
Yeah. Sorry about that, Jamil. I was, as you were finishing that, I got sparked on something, and I wanted to bring that to our awareness as well as a build on what you just said. Sure. I don't know if you have come across him, but Robert Pearl, who's a surgeon and former CEO of Kaiser Permanente. He's written a book called Uncaring: How the Culture of Medicine Kills Doctors and Patients. And he teaches actually at Stanford. So I wondered if your paths had crossed.
No, I've actually not heard of him, but I will definitely check that out. It reminds me of the book Compassionomics, which is sort of, I guess, the opposite of that, a case for how more compassionate medicine would actually save everybody both time and money, in addition to being more human and healthy.
Yeah. So I think you'll really enjoy this. I'll send it over to you. In fact, let me see if I can put that in the chat window for all of us as well. It's an op-ed that he wrote recently that Reenu, my wife, just kind of like shared it, with me, and it's like so apropos for the conversation we were just having. And he's talking about this empathy crisis, really, in medicine, and he says something quite similar to what we were just talking about, the Jason and the teachers were doing, where he says, like, wouldn't it be nice if the physicians could just like imagine that the person they're serving is their own child, is their own son or daughter? What would that do to the way they would actually talk about health and engage on making choices about and all of that? Anyway, so I thought that was powerful. Yeah.
What do you think would happen to our culture, Hitendra, if everybody carried around a baby picture of themselves and you had to look at it before you interacted with them?
Wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. But I love these little quick fixes, these little nudges, that you've been working on. And, let's maybe kind of, before we close our out with a little bit more of your personal journey, let's, if you're open to it, share one or two insights you can for those of us who are in this maybe role or position of responsibility where there is a team or a community that we are managing, leading, influencing in some way. And if you want to like activate more empathy across that system, helping, like encouraging people to carry that picture of them as a child or as a baby. What are some other such like simple things that we can do to bring more empathy into our collective consciousness?
Yeah. So, I think that, especially for people who are leaders in any capacity, but let's focus on, let's say you're leading a work team. There's so many different simple things that we can do. The first is really distributing attention, right? So oftentimes it's very easy for, certain voices to dominate conversations in the workplace and beyond. And that's typical, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that there's lots of examples of ways that leaders can, for instance, flatten a team meeting or slow it down to ensure that everybody has a voice or feels that they can voice their opinions safely and openly in that space. And that can create not just empathy, but also psychological safety, which is critical to a successful work team. Another thing is how we reward people and what we encourage and what we highlight. And I think oftentimes in the workplace, we focus on individual contributions, and that's fine. But I think if we hyper-focus only on people's ability to excel at their own tasks, we kind of put them in little silos where they're not really that motivated to connect with or help one another. If instead, as some organizations do, we highlight and promote on and reward also collaborative outputs, not just what people do on their own, but how they show up for each other, that again resets the social norm and resets the incentive structure of a space, an organization, to encourage people, again, not to invent a kind person who they're not, but to express the kind person, the empathic person who they really are in a workplace setting.
Ah, very nice. These are such practical things that we can take on. Beautiful. There are a couple of nice suggestions coming from our friends in the audience as well. Gabe is talking about how, pause, breathe, be silent, and think and be present. That moment of mindfulness, that helps. Just, bring less distraction, right, to the moment. And then Ram is talking about, I used to have every team member have a smiling baby face, at his service call center. And it made a big difference. Probably it sounds like it doesn't even have to be like you as the baby, but just like some baby, just does it.
I love those. Yeah, those are great suggestions.
Yeah, this is great. And then, Jacqueline, you're asking a question about how you can get in touch with what you're saying is the researcher focus on intervention strategies for teachers. I think you're referring to Jason. And Jamil, you mentioned that he's now a professor at UC Berkeley. Right. So I'm assuming that his contact information should be there. And Jacqueline, you can get more about that story, which I encourage you to read if you haven't fully yet seen Jamil's book, to see it in Jamil's book. And and then you'll get more about Jason, and that perhaps will give you a natural pathway to reaching out to him if there's a professional meeting of minds there that you want to explore. So thank you for that. So Jamil, let's come to the very, very roots of your journey. You're passionate about empathy. You are a pioneer in this field. You are, I can see deeply invested in it. Just in every moment that you live and breathe. Beyond just the scholarship. Which itself is profound and beautiful. And where does it come from? What has been for you your most formative experience in life that just woke you up to the possibilities of empathy?
Yeah, well, I mean, you were talking about it earlier. It's family life, right? I mean, I think that family is the root of so many parts of who we are, and for me, that's certainly true. So, my mother is from Peru, and my father is from Pakistan. They both immigrated to the U.S. When they were in their 20s, and met in, of all places, Pullman, Washington, this little tiny town in Washington State, where they were both going to graduate school. And I think that my mother and father fell in love as many people who are foreign to a place do, because of their sense of foreignness. I think that they both felt pretty uncomfortable in the US and kind of found comfort in each other through that, or at least a shared journey. But then, of course, they became more comfortable in the US. They've been here for 49 years now. I think they quickly realized how little they have in common, which Hitendra, as their only child, I can tell you is very little. Like nothing. And so they had a long and pretty bitter divorce that it really engulfed much of my childhood. And I'm their only child. And so a lot of my time from when I was basically 6 to when I was 12 was spent basically as the single bridge between these two realities that were so different from one another, different culturally, different emotionally, and different personally. And these two worlds that were also at war with one another. And so a lot of my experience as a kid was basically trying really hard to connect with my mother, learning how to do that, and then going to my dad's house and realizing that the exact same thing utterly failed to connect with him. And it was a real struggle. I mean, it was a time of great pain, I think, for all three of us. But I think that, at some point in that, I really learned that, hey, if I want to keep my relationship to my parents, which I desperately did, I needed to learn to tune myself to their different frequencies. I often talk about my parents' divorce as being an empathy gym for me, right? A place that forced me to work at care and understanding, forced me to understand that these two people had very different worlds, but they were both really wonderful, loving people who were in a lot of pain, but wanted to be there with me. And I think that that's the most profound thing I ever learned. And, I think in my life since then, one of my missions has been to create empathy gyms for other people, right? To give other people the opportunity to do that work, hopefully without the context of as much pain and struggle as I was going through at the time, but still to provide that opportunity for others.
Oh, that is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. I can't even imagine what it must have been like, for all three of you, and yet to make something so impactful come out of this in a way that hasn't really only shaped your life and formed you, but also through you, you are shaping and forming, so many of us as well, beyond the multiplier impacts of actually a moment of adversity. It's so incredible, so incredible. And actually, suddenly I'm again sparked again with the story of Buck. Have you heard of Buck at all?
No.
I think you'll enjoy hearing about him. So he's a rancher. He's a cowboy, and there was a documentary made on him. That's how I came to know about him, called Buck. And and he goes around the country training ranchers to become like more effective at drawing out the best in their horses. And he is considered like essentially the horse whisperer. So there was the book called The Horse Whisperer, which was actually written inspired by his story. And then the movie, The Horse Whisperer, that was made by Robert Redford, was actually on the basis of that book, and he was hired at that time to help provide guidance on how to get like these horses to eat from the hands of the movie makers, because he's just so good. He's just like a wizard with horses. And if you ask him, like, how did this capacity develop in you? How did this interest develop in you? What he says is that, look, traditionally horses have been raised in America with the idea of like fear of punishment, that if you don't do the right thing, you're gonna be punished and inflicted with some pain. And he says like it's the complete opposite of what we should do. We need to kind of train them through love and compassion and empathy. And he says that the horse is so attuned to a human being and vice versa, that you should just become one with the horse. How can you sit on a horse and say, look, the horse just kind of is like disobeying me? Would you ever be talking to somebody and your feet just like travel in a different direction from the rest of you and all that? It wouldn't happen, right? So why would it happen with a horse if you're united with the horse? And so he brings about this like, kindness revolution, as you call it, right? To the way ranchers are dealing with the horses. And if you go to the roots of it, he actually says, I grew up in very difficult circumstances. In his case, I think his mother passed away really early. He had an alcoholic father who, it was a tough time for him. Ultimately, he had to be raised in foster care. Wow. And he says, through that, like I've discovered, like I don't want anybody in the world to go through this, not even horses. So you have this in your book. You have this idea about empathy being born from adversity, and the science of that, which I think is very powerful as well. And I see that you have chosen to make something out of that moment in such a beautiful way.
And that story of Buck is really beautiful as well. Yeah, there's a whole world of research on what is known as altruism born of suffering. This is the idea that actually moments of great trial and tribulation and pain, both at a personal level and at a collective level, can show us who we really are. And in many cases, that means showing us how much we want to be there for other people. And, so there's all sorts of cases and stories and studies of people who have gone through trauma, whether it's war or assault or injury, accidents, turning around and really refocusing their lives on service to others. And that's part of what we would call post-traumatic growth. I think, Hitendra, this is a great note to sort of think about as we move into the future, because we're all going through probably the largest event of global adversity that I've ever experienced, or in most people's lifetimes who are alive right now in the COVID pandemic. And it continues, and it will have reverberating effects on our lives for decades to come, because of the pain that many of us have gone through, various forms of pain. And I think a big question for me is, what are we going to do with this difficult, painful experience? Are we going to, as it can easily, let it make us more divided and more sort of, I guess, crammed into ourselves? Or are we going to try to rediscover our common humanity through it, to sort of realize what we owe each other and what we need from each other, and recenter, I hope, human connection in whatever this new normal is that emerges after this pandemic.
Oh, wow. That's such a great message to give us, to start bringing us to closure. Thank you. Thank you, Jamil. And yeah, I should let our audience and you also, go back into your beautiful lives. This has been such a rewarding conversation. I really don't want to let you go. I want to keep this going. But we look forward to having another episode of Intersections that we can have you back as you keep plowing this really beautiful path, and maybe, come back with some stories about some of these contributions you and your students are making to make us, just like, a better, humanity with, even with the current conditions, actually, in fact, being a source of inspiration and guidance and motivation to us to actually do our life's best work. So let's come back and have you back here, at some point in the very near future, Jamil. It would be such a joy to do that. And I'm so grateful and thankful for what we've been able to make happen here together today. And I'm looking forward to much collaboration with you, as well as opportunities just to see your work flourish in the world. So important. Thank you for all you do.
Oh, and thank you, Hitendra. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I obviously look forward to many more conversations to come.
Yeah. All the best. And then as we bid adieu to Jamil, which I know all of you are feeling also so grateful to. Thank you, Jamil, for being with us. I want to just very quickly bring up what we were going to do next time. And so our next Intersections is going to be with Amandine Roche. Amandine will build on Jamil's ideas and thoughts. She is quite a remarkable figure who, among other things, has taught meditation to the Taliban in Afghanistan. She's a United Nations social worker and has had remarkable experiences of personal transformation and support for communities in challenged parts of the world. And so again, this theme of empathy, this theme of service to humanity continues from Jamil to Amandine next. I really want to express my tremendous excitement and joy for what Jamil has done for us today. I hope all of you feel deeply sparked, both by the central force of empathy as a critical factor that all of us embrace, then with the idea that it's actually a muscle that can be built, and then that there are practical steps we can take towards doing so in our own lives, steps that can bring a lot of joy and fulfillment in just the act of doing. Then the idea that we can tie it back to our own life story and the struggles that we may have faced in the past, actually becoming catalysts for us becoming that much more empathetic for the world. Something that, I'm seeing some of you also echo in your conversations back here, like Srijit, you did, right? And finally, this idea that we can actually proliferate it across communities, just like Jason is doing the school system and others are doing pioneering work in so many corporate contexts as well, through the kind of design and nudging elements that Jamil talked to us about today. I really encourage you to read his book, and then Godspeed. We will see you soon. By the way, good news, we also have Intersections now in the form of podcasts, on Google and Spotify and Apple. So, encourage you to see it there and share it there with your friends when you can. And we will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.